Thank you very much. I'm somewhat speechless. If the professor can become speechless, there's something going on. You realize that. It's been a fantastic evening for me, and I'm greatly honored. And on the other hand, I feel I'm with family. As the Lord Mayor-elect has mentioned, we're neighbors. We've known each other for quite some time, and Michael and I go back some time. So yes, it's fantastic to be here. I'm an economist, and there is a sense in which we all of us here in this room, this hall, have conflicting views, because we are both economists at the same time as being concerned with the biosphere, that huge entity in which we are embedded, and we don't quite recognize it. Maybe we recognize it on Sundays, but not on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays and Saturdays, when we go about our. And the review that Nick mentioned was an attempt on my part to try and reconcile these opposing tendencies that we all have. The question arises, why do we have these opposing tendencies? We tend to not feel, as we grow up, there are always tensions, of course. I can't have this if I have that, and I can't have that if I have this. That's part of life. But there is something deeper here. The concern with economic growth, as rightly was pointing out, because in some sense the standard of living is defined in terms of gross income. Do bear in mind I meant gross income, okay, not net income, gross income. And at the same time we worry about the fact that Mother Nature is part of us and we are part of her, and something's gone awry. And something has indeed gone awry in a big way. Globally we are in a mess, totally a mess. That's one of the findings of my review. That's not an argument for throwing up the towel. That's not the point. We need to find ways out of it. A lot of it has to do with collective action, and I don't mean within community, but the global community. And we're not getting much of that at the moment. And I'll come back to that at the end. So where is the tension come from? And I've thought very hard about it, and here is one take. And I'm a professor, so I am giving you a tutorial, by the way. So that's part of the deal, okay? I mean, you wouldn't invite a professor unless you wanted a tutorial. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2005, of which I was an advisor at large, came up with a classification of goods and services that Mother Nature offers us, which I hadn't really appreciated at that time, but I think is extremely profound. So broadly speaking, there are two classes of services. One is what they call provisional goods. Food, water, timber, fibers, pharmaceuticals, all the stuff out there which, with human labor and machines that we create, produces final outputs which we call GDP. Measured in market prices, of course, but I'll ignore that for the moment. But underneath it all, the thing which as citizens, as human beings, we are aware of, but we don't like to articulate because we're not encouraged to do, are what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment suggested are maintenance and regulating services. These are services, these are not goods. The objects are the phenomena, or the epiphenomenon. Underneath it, like basic industries, are the services that Mother Nature is offering us all the time, very often invisible, most often silent. Think of all the things that are going on our feet. And by the way, in one sense, I feel a fraud talking to this community. We're familiar with that. And what are these services? There will be, well, of course, pollination is one. carbon capture is another. Cleansing of water by the watersheds is another. Decomposition of waste, which we often ignore. But without that, we would be dead, we'd be sunk. So there is background services that Mother Nature is offering on the basis of which these provisioning goods are offered. We economists have concentrated on the provisioning goods. And the economics of climate change, which you're familiar with, sees it as a tool for which to think of the possibility of substitution across these provisioning goods. So clean energy, zero net emissions. The whole idea is that you could go for GDP growth, gross income growth, even while you transit, and you can do that by transiting to clean energy. But of course, that looks at one particular set of regulating and maintenance services, namely climate regulation. But there are thousands and thousands, uncountable, at least as far as we know, services that Mother Nature offers which are complementary to climate change. Think of the rainforest and what the services they offer with the climate regulation, and you can see the complementarities there. Now, Mother Nature is not a house of cards. She's resilient, obviously, goes without saying. But we are so clever now that we can make her into a house of cards if we wish to, and we are in the process of doing that at the moment. So with that background, I want to talk about two classes of issues which are prominent in my review, and it's the ones which I have a great deal of interest in, but unfortunately I'm told by my more learned colleagues in the Treasury and the United Nations and so forth, the world isn't ready for it yet. One of them is, I should begin by reminding ourselves that my review was on the economics of biodiversity, as was pointed out. But in fact, pretty quickly I realized that I wouldn't be writing about biodiversity, but I would be talking about ecosystems, because they are capital assets. Rainforests, wetlands, coastal fisheries, and so forth. Biodiversity, if defined reasonably carefully, is a property of ecosystems which enhances the productivity of ecosystems. That's the idea. And of course, I didn't belabor this point because this association understands that extremely well as to what biodiversity does for us. But it's the ecosystems which I wanted to capture because they're the assets which are not included in economic models. We include buildings, roads, ports, and so machines. We include human capital, education, health, and so forth. But ecosystems, they don't appear in GDP because it's concerned with gross income. It doesn't measure net income. Namely, it doesn't deduct the depreciation of capital assets. And of course, that's what we're talking about here. Namely, we're trashing Mother Nature, which is the depreciation of that asset. And that's not included in the measure that we use to discuss economic growth. So the two points that I wanted to raise with you, which I think are extremely important, but easy to miss. There are these biomes which are offering us uncountable services of the kind that I just mentioned, maintenance and regulating services. One of them is the open oceans. The oceans themselves, 70% of the Earth's surface. And then the rainforests, tropical rainforests. Now they are interesting because they are global public goods. They're offering the service to all of humanity, not just us in the UK, but the whole of the world. The former type, at least beyond the 200-mile limits, EEZ, beyond the EEZ, are effectively open access. Think of the trillions of dollars of merchandise that are transmitted across the oceans. We see them, these big tankers fully. And then think of the cruises. That's a small fraction, by the way, in terms of monetary value. And the fishing that goes on, and the trash that we deposit into the oceans. The open oceans are open access. They belong to everybody, and therefore they belong to nobody. And that's the key thing. They're called common property resources, open access resources. So we trash them, because we can use it for free. Now, you will appreciate that if you have an asset, unless there's an ownership, somebody who charges for it, and of course Mother Nature doesn't have a checkout counter. So when you take out from her, we don't have to pay. We are exceeding, we are taking more than is warranted. And of course that's what I mean about trashing. So that's one. I want to keep that. The other is interesting, the tropical rainforests of Brazil, Colombia, the huge swath region in Latin America, Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so forth. They are global public goods. We all benefit from them, and I don't need to belabor the point, because you know why, in what way they do. They're the seat of some of the greatest biodiversity on Earth, and therefore the productivity is seen by the amount of services they offer the whole world. But of course, they are not open access. They're within national jurisdiction. Now, we all complain every time we read in the newspapers and magazines about how much of the size of Portugal is being removed from the rainforest in Brazil. We've been reading that for years. We complain and we moan. And yet, the solution in some sense is staring at our face. When the president of Brazil, no matter what we think of him, and this is not the place to talk about that, because we're a polite society here, but there's a logic there. The person can say, well, look, we have our needs, and we are a small part of the global economy. If you value it, you should pay us to preserve it. That's called payment for ecosystem services, which is now becoming a commonplace within national jurisdictions. We pay farmers, the state pays farmers to do this or that, and whatever. And in Costa Rica, New Zealand, many countries, this is becoming a major movement, and absolutely right, because otherwise these externalities, these benefits, that the property that we own transfers on to others is not being paid for, so we don't have the incentive to preserve them. That's pretty straightforward economics. So here's what I thought, and one of the things that the review tries to do is to argue that the time's come, maybe we ought to, like at the end of the Second World War, when Europe was down on her feet, the Far East was completely destroyed through the war. The decision makers, politicians, had the wisdom to create the United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, and all the organizations that came out of it. These were all serving public goods, global public goods. Let's say the IMF for financial stability, the World Bank for reconstruction and development, the United Nations for reasons that the services that you can easily understand. So we have that. Why do we not, in this urgent period when the demands that we are making on Mother Nature so far exceeds her ability to meet that demand on a sustainable basis, of the order of now 1.7, 1.8, whence the rhetoric that we need 1.7 Earths to satisfy our needs. So we are really in a crisis situation globally. Why can't we think of an international organization which will monitor and charge for the use, the rents, collect the rents for the use of the oceans in order to reduce the burden that she experiences by our demand? That would collect billions and billions of dollars. Crude calculations suggest that because we're looking at trillions of dollars of transport, which is going for free, okay? And we could use part of that for subsidizing, for payment for the ecosystem services that the rainforests offer. Now, of course, that involves negotiation, and of course there'll be a huge amount of cheating and and so forth. But that's part of life. If you're going to negotiate, you know that the guy is going to ask for more than he deserves. But that's nothing new of that. That amount, simple calculation suggests, is considerably lower than the amount of rents that we can collect from the oceans. These are big things, and I've been talking about that since one of the really pleasurable features of my review, in the sense of my experiences, was that the Treasury not only gave me an absolutely wonderful team to work with for preparing the review, but when it was launched in February, as was mentioned in 2021, they kept my team for another 1 full year. Now, given how mean the Treasury is, that's a hell of a gesture, because they cost money. But the team was kept to disseminate the review. And I wouldn't be in a position to do that, so of course their experts are doing that. I've had many, many such events. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that one of the clear answers I get, reactions I get to the suggestion that I've just now sketched before you, is that we haven't got the stomach for it. Meanwhile, of course, Mother Nature is being trashed. I want to conclude by simply pointing out why these issues are not just urgent, but they, in some sense, permeate all our life, everywhere. And one of the things that I, as a teacher, like to emphasize is that if you get some aspect of your analysis, whether it's about the global economy or whether it's your family, wrong, it tends to divert you in a direction which you get many, many other things wrong. So errors at any one stage tend to multiply elsewhere. Okay, why do I mention that? I think at every stage this enormous imbalance we have created globally of the demand we make of Mother Nature's services, these maintenance and regulating services, which are silent and nobody talks on behalf of those services, and her ability to supply them on a sustainable basis, means that it has come about because at every small step we take, what we call traditional economic arguments, that is, an argument about profitability of one kind or the other, which does not take nature into account, overrides the countervailing point. So today, only 2 weeks ago, the Economist had a lead. Main feature was the strangulation of the bulldozer, because the idea was that our environmental laws in this country are strangulating economic progress. The cover was of a bulldozer which had been wrapped around so that it couldn't move. And yet, there is a sense in which they're right, and in a deep sense that they're totally wrong. It's right that at every minor move you make, you say, well, are you going to forsake 200 apartment buildings that could be constructed here because somebody has said there's a bat family out there which can't be removed? That can't be right, because otherwise the value you place on the bats would be so large to make it an economically profitable alternative. It's just, it can't be right. And there's truth in that. On the other hand, we forget, that same people who wrote that piece forgot, that we in the UK are living beyond our means because our ecological footprint is enormous by the standards of most countries. And we do that because we're importing biodiversity from elsewhere. We've already trashed ours, and the bat family, or the community of bats that are going to be trashed because we need to build these apartment complexes, truly It's not going to affect the British economy, UK economy, that's for sure. So that kind of argument is correct. But the point is, how do we, as a nation, ask the poorer countries which house the world's tropical forest to go slow and say, well, biodiversity is important? If we then say, of course not for us, but for you it is. So there is a problem here, in my judgment. And it requires some, in my judgment, something like a code of behavior which tells others, signals to other countries with which we have to cooperate because we are looking at global public goods. This is not a national good. That we'll be willing to sacrifice something. And this is maybe a token, but it's an extremely important token, that we are giving up something of value to us, which is enormous, people to live in, here rather than there, because we want to preserve some biodiversity. Pollinators, for example, which are going to be trashed otherwise. Because otherwise we don't have the moral authority to be able to negotiate with other countries about preserving Mother Nature. So these are the dilemmas I feel. I live with it. I have lived with it for 40 years, believe it or not. And so when the Chancellor of the Exchequer asked me to prepare this review in spring 2019, I had absolutely no doubt that I would do it. Because I was the only person I felt, I think rightly actually, who could do it. Because I feel there's something wrong with economics in the way we have practiced it. The problem isn't with economics. It's a great subject. It's a fantastic subject. It's given us a grammar, but we just misused the grammar. And I'll try to give you an idea of how we have misused it in context of two global public goods, namely the oceans and the rainforest. When would you last see an economic report in which the oceans were mentioned or the forests were rainforests were mentioned? So I rest my case. Thank you very much.